Okay. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. We are here on this Erev Shabbat as we continue on through the triennial Torah portion. We'll be looking at today. I think that we will have a slightly abbreviated Midrash this evening. We'll just look at the actual Torah portion, and we'll deal with some things that we find inside of the Torah portion which help us to prepare for where we are seasonally in regards to it being after this weekly Shabbat, it being the Day of Atonement. Okay, so we'll find some jewels inside of this week's Torah portion which help us to deal with some key principles that are found inside of Yom Kippur. Okay, so what we want to do is we'll be looking at Leviticus chapter 5. Chapter 5. And we will read Leviticus chapter 5 through the end of the chapter. Hiski, do you have chapter 5 ready?
No, I do.
Okay, go ahead and read chapter. I don't know what's going on with this camera.
And if a soul sin and hear the voice of swearing and is a witness, whether he has seen or not or known of it, if he do not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity. Or if a soul touch any unclean thing, whether it be a carcass of an unclean beast, or a carcass of an unclean cattle, or a carcass of unclean creeping things, and if it be hidden from him, he also shall be unclean and guilty. For if he touch the uncleanness of man, whatsoever uncleanness it be, that a man shall be defiled withal, and it be hid from him. When he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty. Or if a soul swear pronouncing with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatsoever it will be, that man shall pronounce with an oath, it be hid from him. When he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty in one of these. And it shall be when he shall be guilty in one of these things that he shall confess that he hath sinned in that thing. And he shall bring his trespass offering unto, and he shall bring,
Verse 6.
Oh, no. 5, 6?
Yes.
And he shall bring his trespasses offering unto Yahweh for his sin, which he hath sinned, a female from the flock, and lamb, or a kid of the goats, for a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for him concerning his sin. And if he not be able to bring a lamb, then he shall bring for his trespass, which he hath committed, 2 turtle doves, or 2 young pigeons unto Yahweh. 1 for sin offering, and 1 for the other for a burnt offering, and the other for a burnt. And he shall bring them unto the priest, who shall offer that which is for the sin offering first, and wring off his head from his neck, but shall not divide it asunder. And he shall sprinkle of the blood of the sin offering upon the side of the altar, and the rest of the blood shall be wrung out at the bottom of the altar. It is a sin offering. And he shall offer a second for a burnt offering, according to the manner. And the priest shall make an atonement for him for his sin which he hath sinned, and it shall be forgiven. It shall be forgiven him. But if he not be able to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, then he that sin shall bring for his offering the 10th part of an ephah of fine flour for a sin offering. He shall put no oil upon it, neither shall he put any frankincense thereon. For it is a sin offering. Then shall he bring it to the priest, and the priest shall take his handful of it, even a memorial thereof, and burn it on the altar, according to the offerings made by fire unto Yahweh. It is a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for him, and as touching his sin, that he hath sinned in one of these, and it shall be forgiven him, and the remnant shall be the priest as a meat offering. And Yahweh spoke unto Moses, saying, if a soul commit a trespass and sin through ignorance in the holy things of Yahweh, then he shall bring for his trespass unto Yahweh a ram without blemish out of the flocks, with thy estimation by shekels of silver, after the shekel of the sanctuary, for a trespass offering. And he shall make amends for the harm that he hath done in the holy thing, and shall add the 5th part thereto, and give it unto the priest. And the priest shall make an atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering, and it shall be forgiven him. And if a soul sin and commit any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of Yahweh, though he wist it not, yet he is guilty. Yet is he guilty, and shall bear his iniquity. And he shall bring a ram without blemish out of the flock with thy estimation for a trespass offering. Unto the priest ignorance wherein he erred, and wist it not, and it shall be forgiven him. It is a trespass offering. He hath certainly trespassed against Yahweh. Oh, wait. I have to do that.
Okay. Okay, very good. Okay, so looking back at, let me just do this. This camera's messing up. Okay, so looking back at what we just looked at, thinking about also what we read and discussed last week, we'll be touching on some of those things tonight, and then adding to that, of course, as we move forward with chapter 5. Last week we talked about if a soul sinned in ignorance. And here we are dealing with different trespass offerings. Wait a second. Trespass offerings, specifically what you might bring, and some examples on what actually constitutes, these specific sins. I wanted to look at a couple things here. When we looked at the first verse, we go all the way back to the first verse where it says, in the King James, if a soul sin and hear the voice of swearing and is a witness, whether he has seen or known of it, if he do not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity. Another version of that same verse, I believe this is the New American Standard Version, which says, now if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration to testify,
that's mine. New American Standard. When
he is a witness, whether he has seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, then he will bear his guilt. This other version here, the CSB. Hold on, what? I forget what the CSB actually stands for. I forget that.
You want me to get it?
Yeah, look that up. What that stands for, CSB. When someone sins in any of these ways, if he has seen, heard, or known about something he has witnessed and did not respond to a public call to testify, he will bear his iniquity.
Christian Standard Bible.
Yeah, Christian Standard Bible. Okay, so we're looking at some things here in terms of the soul, a person. If a soul, a person, an individual, a being, right? If a soul sins, after he hears this voice of swearing, this public adjuration to testify, and is a witness of this thing that he has seen or known of it, if he does not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity. So you're talking about someone being called into questioning about a thing that you have seen, an official call to questioning. I guess what we would think about would be something like a subpoena, right? If you're subpoenaed, you're called, you're ordered to come to court So if I think that you are a witness to a thing, and I call you, and I officially call you, and request this you to witness a thing, you must say whatever it is that you saw, or else it says here, you shall bear your iniquity. So let's look at some of these things here. We're dealing with, again, the word sin, which is kata, which deals with missing the mark. You were trying to go straight and you veered off path. You were trying to serve properly and correctly, and you made a mistake. It's a mistake, right? It's not an intent. You did not intentionally do a wrong thing, but you did do a wrong thing, just kind of by a mistake, right? Even though here it's not specifically dealing with doing a thing in ignorance, but again, that kata, that sin, that kind of initial level of sin is dealing with just a veer off path. You're aiming for the target and you missed. You tried to do what's right and you didn't quite make it. Right? So it's talking about here, and hear the voice of swearing. So in other words, it's this official call, as we just said, a subpoena. That's an official request for you to bring your testimony, your side of the story to this thing that you saw. We think about kind of the culture that we live in. Unfortunately, when you look, and we have this whole concept of snitching, and people want to kind of stay away from snitching. But when we see right here, this thing that's being described here really is it's snitching, right? You saw something, you saw what happened, you're able to give testimony to this thing that happened. You're able to give testimony, and then you refuse to do it.
So it's like you don't even with a subpoena, if they subpoena you about something, it's like an official request of information from you, and it could be snitching.
Well, I'm just using that term just because that's what
when you sin, somebody sinned or whatever.
You witnessed a thing, and people. I'm not necessarily calling it snitching, but if we witness something going on in the street, and then I see who did it, and then the police come and talk to me and ask me who did it, and I'd be like, it was them. According to the world, you know what I mean? That's snitching. But like in regular life, like even here in this Torah-based society, we would just call that just witnessing something, right? We would just call that being a witness to something that happened, right? Somehow in this society that we live in today, being a witness turned into a negative thing, and then it turned into being a snitch, right? It got this negative kind of connotation where people didn't want to be a witness to somebody, whether it be because of fear of some type of, some retaliation from the bad guys and so on and so forth. But just a total breakdown of, the whole judicial situation. But when we look here, this When we look this up here in this first verse, this voice of swearing, this is Kol Allah. Kol Allah. Kol, which means to call aloud, to voice or sound, crackling cry, noise, to proclaim a proclamation, to spark a thundering voice. Right? It's this word, it's the word that kind of has the connotation of this. It's translated here as voice, but it literally means to call aloud. So it's this cry, it's this outcry, it's this voice, it's this call of swearing, which in the Septuagint, I guess they get the rendering of the voice of adjuration, or that's what it also says in the. So what it says in the New American Standard. Okay, so this deals with. This does not relate to the duty of informing against a common swear, but to the case of a person who, being adjured by the civil magistrate to answer upon oath, refuses to declare what he knows upon the subject, such as one shall bear his iniquity. Right? So when we have here this thing where we plead the fifth, right? When we refuse,
well, the fifth is you refuse to give any damaging information
against your own self, but it's still the idea is you could testify about this thing, but we would plead the Fifth Amendment because if I testify to this thing, it could potentially hurt me. But still, that seems to still fall into this category here in terms of this, answering this call of swearing, this voice of swearing.
It could be cursing. I'm looking at the definition of that word.
Well, the word, I guess a swear could be something that's positive or negative. So in terms of a curse, that would just be kind of just negative words.
Yeah.
As opposed to
condemnation,
positive words, right? So it's kind of this official call again to have this witness. So again, if you was to be quiet in this situation, it's saying that you now he shall bear his iniquity. So I think it's interesting that we go from this situation where you're dealing with sin, chata, where again when we're looking at sin, again this kata is dealing with again missing the mark, and it goes into this concept of avon, which is iniquity, perversity, evil, right? Iniquity, again, we look at these different levels of sin. It goes from sin to transgression to iniquity. It goes from missing the mark to intentionally missing the mark, or missing the mark on purpose, to continually missing the mark on purpose.
Like the first degree, or first degree murder or whatever. You have premeditation. It's a mental. It's in your mind. It's not like accidental, like manslaughter.
Yeah, right. So basically basically what happens here is this sin went from a manslaughter to a first degree murder, kind of just based on how you dealt with the situation, right? Because it turned into, what it turned into was, again, as it says, is iniquity. So when we look at this, when we look at verse 2, again, well, you know, as we look at, just continue to look at some of these other things, we got to look at this word here, witness. It's calling for you to witness, which means literally to witness, or abstractly, it means testimony, a recorder that is a witness. It calls.
Just so Shay said, where's trespass? Where's trespass before transgression, right?
Say that again.
Sorry, please. Where's trespass before transgression, right?
Where's trespass before transgression?
Right.
Trespass is equivalent to the guilt. I believe we spoke about this. I guess we spoke about this amongst ourselves. Trespass is the guilt. Just like we talked about last week in terms of the guilt, in terms of if I do a thing, then I'm guilty. Right? So the trespass, if I sin, I've trespassed, or if I transgress, I've trespassed, or if I am in iniquity, I've trespassed. The trespass is kind of the action part. It's the guilt associated with the wrong that was done.
And then transgression.
And transgression, now the difference between transgression and trespass is really, well, I don't think there's a difference between the two, because you trespass whether you sin, whether you transgress, or whether there's iniquity involved. The transgression would be what we're not dealing with here necessarily, with that whole sin that you've done on purpose. Is dealing with trespass, which is just the overall kind of catch-all thing, the guilt. And actually, let's see, verse 6, it actually uses the actual word trespass. In verse 6, trespass, because they're bringing a trespass offering, which is the word asham, which is, like I said, which is basically just the guilt. Asham is fault, guilt, guiltiness. So it's basically the state that you're in as a result of the sin that was committed. Okay, so we look at verse number 2. Verse 2, we see some interesting things.
Oh, wait, hold on. Okay, so it's not on the sin chart, question mark. So trespass is guilt and generic. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Right, so there's not an extra level of sin that we missed in terms of the levels of sin being sin, transgression, and iniquity. It's not like we missed a level where trespass needs to be in there somewhere. It's generic. It's the generic guilt that's associated with being wrong, the guiltiness that's associated with any sin on any level. Yes. Okay, so when we look at verse number 2, where it says, or, because again, when we look at this whole chapter in general, this is a trespass offering. All of it is dealing with a trespass offering. So it's really just this guilt offering, this guilt that has been put on you based on your actions, based on the thing that you've done. The results of these actions call for these specific offerings, whether it be the lamb or the ram or the turtle dove, based on your economic position. But in verse 2, I think there's some interesting things that we can find in regards to kind of the process upon which we deal with sin. Verse 2, where it says, or if a soul touch any unclean thing, whether it be a carcass or an unclean beast, or a carcass of unclean cattle, or the carcass of unclean creeping things, and if it be hidden from him, he also shall be unclean and guilty. Right, so we talked about this a little bit last week in terms of if you were to do a thing and you didn't know it, like you sin unintentionally, it doesn't take away the fact that there's guilt associated with the thing that you've done. Now, after you recognize what it is that you've done, now you're able to deal with it in a certain way, right? You're able to bring your offering, your sacrifice, to atone for the thing that you've done after it's been brought to your attention. But it's not as if you're not guilty because you didn't know. Right? And we used the example of, we talked about trespass, and we used the example of if I have property and my property is not fenced in, but say I just have landmarks, right? I have landmarks, and between those landmarks are is my property. So whether you know it or not, you still trespass onto my property, even if you don't know it, right? It's not as if you're not on my property just because you don't know you're on my property. So when we look at the Torah, when we look at Yahweh's law, statutes, and commandments, just because you don't know that he doesn't like for you to do this or that, it doesn't mean that you're not guilty. It doesn't mean that you're not guilty, if you don't know what it is that you've done. And we look at this, verse 2, where it says, and if it be hidden from him, he also shall be unclean and guilty. Right? So the thing that he did, the thing that he touched, the animal that he came across, this unclean beast or this unclean cattle, so on and so forth, he touched it or whatever. He's unclean and he's guilty, even though we're talking about this hidden thing. Now, when he finds out about it, now he's able to address the issue. But it's not as if he's not responsible for the trespass, prior to the knowledge. You're still responsible, and there's still guilt attached to it, but you're not doing anything about it. You're not addressing it, because of course we're talking about this thing that is hidden, right? So again, we look at this idea of this whole concept of trespass when we go down to verse 5. We go down to verse 5, and it shall be when he shall be guilty of one of these things that he shall confess that he hath sinned in that thing. And again, that word guilty is the same word for transgress, which is asham. Asham. Asham, which means to be guilty. The word means to be guilty. Right?
Yeah.
And again, we talked about last week the difference between this idea of being guilty and feeling guilty. That conscience, that feeling of guilt has nothing to do with what we're talking about here in terms of this asham. This here word that means to be guilty is a state. It's a state of being, right? It's a place that you are in as a result of the sin. So when we look at this,
it's really interesting. These things, they don't know about it. It's hidden.
No, yeah.
They're like just speaking without thinking, thoughtlessly. Verse 4. A person swears thoughtlessly with his lips, to do good or evil.
Right. That's verse 4. Okay, so yeah, so when we look at that, this idea of swearing thoughtlessly, that swear, what is that? Shabbat? Let's see.
Verse 4. Yeah.
Shabbat.
Uh-huh.
To swear. Right, to swear.
Yeah.
Take an oath.
Right, so we have to remember that when we speak, right? When we speak, Yeshua talked about letting your yays be yay and your nays be nay. If you said a thing, you swore it. Right? If you said a thing, you swore it. Your word is an oath to you, right? So this is talking about swearing a thing thoughtlessly. Now, when we look at this word Shabbat, in terms of swearing as a process, right, where it talks about in its definition, the word is to seven oneself, which is kind of repeating a thing, right? So this is kind of a repetitious kind of speaking, right? But here again, we're talking about this doing it thoughtlessly, where that word is batah. So we're talking about a Shabbat batah, Shababata, which is to swear thoughtlessly. I guess they have it. They have it in the. They have it two ways. With a olive or a hay, you find that same word, which literally means to babble. It means to babble. So you're kind of speaking thoughtlessly.
Just didn't even put the words together.
No.
And I need orders.
So when you look at the root, which would be the bait and the tet, you have the basket, the plan, the house plan, right? So if your plan, I guess if your plan is in a basket, it's kind of not something that's
being done.
Well, maybe it's not being done, or it's not kind of put kind of in its proper place. Maybe when you think about this bin, this container, you've taken this plan and you've put it in a container where it's not being used properly. When you think about the idea of babbling, you're just kind of rambling off words without any particular plan about it. What's your question?
When you say letting yays be
Speak up.
when you say letting the yays be yays,
Yes
and nays be
or no?
yes or no, does that like letting bygones be bygones?
Not necessarily, no. They're both sayings, but they're not necessarily connected sayings. If I say I'm going to do something, I shouldn't have to be like, I promise I'll do it. Right? If I said I'm going to do it, all I should have to say is, I'll do it. Or I won't do it. I won't have to say, I promise I do it. I swear I'll do it. So in other words, the point that Yeshua is trying to make is, I shouldn't have to get into the repetitiveness of swearing. I should just be able to say yes or no, and it hold the same weight as if I went through all of the processes of doing whatever needed to be done in terms of swearing. But here, what we're talking about here is if I said a thing and I swore upon this thing, whether it be good or bad, right? And then, but I'm not. It says, if a soul swear, pronouncing with his lips to do evil or good, he's going to do evil or good, whether it be a blessing or a curse. Whatsoever it be that a man shall pronounce with an oath, and it be hid from him, when he knows of it, then he shall be guilty in one of these. And it shall be, when he shall be guilty in one of these things, that he shall confess. Right? So there was this pronouncement that was made. You said you was going to do something and you wasn't even really thinking about what you were saying when you said it. And then come to find out, oh man, I said I was going to do this, that, and the other thing. Right? But you didn't do it because you didn't even realize you said it in the first place. So now it becomes necessary for you to bring this offering now, because now you realize what you have done, how you have erred, and it's necessary to now fix this situation. So when we look at this thing, when we couple 4 with 5, as it says, and it shall be when he shall be guilty in one of these things, and one of these things that happen, whether it be you touching a thing, whether it be you where it talks about hearing this voice of swearing, or whether it be that you've pronounced the thing. Verse 5, and it shall be when he shall be guilty in one of these things, that he shall confess that he has sinned in that thing. Right? So it's interesting that we look at this and, thinking about where we are in the seasons of things, right? How we're at the door of Yom Kippur, at this time, this Day of Atonement, right? We're looking at this chapter here that's dealing with how it is that you deal with sin. We see how this idea of guilt, this asham, is just something that comes as a result of you doing the thing. But then what needs to happen is you have to actually see what it is that you've done. Right? You have to actually recognize what it is that you have done in order to be able to even deal with the thing. Right? Because even though you may be guilty of the sin, there's nothing that could be done about it, because you don't even know that you've done anything. Right? You're not aware.
What happened.
There's no awareness that's connected to it.
Yeah.
Right? So when we look at this idea of confessing in verse 5, where it says, it shall be when he shall be guilty in one of these, that he shall confess. This word confess is yada. Yada.
Make known.
It is to, it sounds just like yada with the ayn, but it's yada with a heck. They both would have the same root, but a slightly different word, right? It looks like.
What verse is that?
5.
Okay.
Yada. Here it means literally to use. Yada. To use. It means to throw. To use, to throw, like a stone or an arrow. To throw at or away. It can mean to revere or to worship. It can mean to revere or to worship. And here, what we see here is being used as, translated as confess. Right, so let's think about this a little bit. When we think about this idea of yada, meaning confess, where it's saying to confess, right? When we look at this, to revere or to worship, it's interesting how we look at these things where this can mean to revere or worship. But if we're looking at these ideas here, this idea of this word yada meaning to revere or to worship, there's also things that go along with, things that get us up to this point, right?
To the point of worship.
To the point of reverence and worship, yes. So here, the thing that that's involved if we are having this thing of revering and worshiping, it is kind of a word, which would be yada with the ayin, which would be that intimate knowledge. Right? There's relationship involved with reverence and with worship. There's a type of intimacy that's involved. Right? So when we're talking about this idea of confessing here, this idea of confessing, there's a connection between you and this thing that has been done, right? If I don't know about the thing, there's no connection between me and the thing, right? Because I don't know it. But now that I realize, that I recognize that there is this connection between me and this thing that I've done, now I'm able to have some connection to this thing, right? I'm able to take responsibility for this thing that I've done. There's a connection that has been made with me and the thing. I've done the thing, but I really wasn't. I spoke thoughtlessly. There's no real connection to. I've thought about it. It's been brought to my remembrance. I've been able to actually see this thing. I've been able to actually recognize that I've done this thing or that thing, and now I want to own this thing, right? And when I'm dealing with this ownership, of course, we're talking about this intimacy, right? This is connectedness that's to it. Then we're talking about here is this this word again, confessing, right? When we look at this word yada, if you have this door, if you have door flap, right? You have this door flap, and you have this arm and this hand. I see the door there, but it's necessary for me to go through the door, right? So I have to take my hand and my arm, and I have to actually interact with the door and move it out of the way so that I can go through. Right? I have to recognize that the door is there.
You're making this a little bit too deep. Like, come on.
What are you talking about? I'm talking about
you have to move the door with your hand.
With your arm and your hand. You have to actually interact with the door, right? You have to become intimate with the door and moving it. You're yadaing it. You're using the door. If I just look at the door, I'm not using it, right? But if I take my arm and my hand and I actually touch it and push it out of the way, now I'm using it. I'm throwing that flap. I'm throwing that flap out of the way and I'm walking through it. Right? So that's what we're looking about in terms of this confession that's going on. I recognize that I've seen that I've done this thing, and now I'm doing
You're
some
acting on
actions.
that. You're acting on your understanding of your
Yes,
sin.
because I can have an understanding. I can have an understanding that there is a door.
That's a lot of people have understanding.
There's a door right over there. I know that there's a door there.
Yeah.
But if I never go through the door, then I'm not using it.
Just as Shan said, you're fine. Keep going.
Right.
No problem.
Right. Okay, so
But I mean, it's just, it's like people know out the door and they don't really do anything with it.
So this
they
is
don't operate on
this is the problem.
They
So
don't confess their sin. Like
this
they
is
get
the
subpoenaed
issue.
and they don't want to confess. Like
This is the problem. So when we dealing with this, what we see here in terms of there being a sin committed, we see this knowledge of the sin. There's knowledge of the sin, but then like this whole chapter is actually dealing with what you do with the knowledge, right? Which is to bring this offering, right? Which would be that taking it to that next level, that action that comes as a result of it. So when we dealing with thinking about this, where we are again with Yom Kippur, thinking about where we are with Yom Kippur, this time that we really should have been in these these previous weeks of introspection and looking at our lives and looking at ourselves and looking for these sins that we may have committed knowingly or unknowingly, and now taking responsibility for these things, owning these things, touching these things and moving them out of the way, right? Actually doing something about the knowledge that we have acquired in regards to, here we're talking about sin. But I think that thinking about just applying these principles in terms of, growing spiritually, if we're talking about moving that door out of the way, it could be dealing with, if the door could be something, even like we talked about the swearing of evil or good. The door could be some wrong that you've committed, but the door could that's blocking you from getting where you need to. The door that's blocking you from getting to the breath, to get into that spirit, right? To get into that perfect picture of praise of the man with his arms raised, right? That door could be sin, or it could be some good thing that you just need to be doing, right? This could either be good or bad, but whatever it is, it's still blocking you from getting over here to this breath, right? Over here to this thing that represents the spirit man, right? This thing that gets you to that intimate relationship, that worship, and that knowledge, the actual use of life and light, that we find in relationship with the Father, right? So that could be here in this particular situation, it's talking about sin. But it could be something that's not necessarily sin, that's still blocking, where you need that action thing to happen for you to move forward. If you know that the Father wants for you to be doing X, Y, Z. We're not talking about stop the stopping of doing a thing, but the positive action, moving in a particular direction. he's calling for you to do X, Y, Z, right? You know that he wants for you to do it. You can see it. You recognize that he's calling for you to actually do the thing. But again, if there's no use of this knowledge, it's good for nothing. Right? So this is what we're dealing with in terms of when we look at this chapter here, in terms of if a soul sins, if we see that there is this sin, we must have this knowledge of it, seeing this wrong that we have committed, accepting this thing, owning this thing, taking responsibility for this thing, and then dealing with it so that we can be forgiven, so our relationship can be repaired, so that our relationship can be restored with the Father.
I think too often we are on the defensive, and too often when something gets brought to our attention, instead of us confessing, we kind of want to defend ourselves.
Right. So when you think about the idea of somebody, I'm just using the word accusation, somebody making an accusation, whether that thing is right or wrong, when we kind of justify the thing, all you're doing is seeing it. So basically all you're doing is agreeing with the accusation. Because you're not talking about how to not do the thing. All you're doing is justifying the fact that you do it. Like you may give reasons why you did it. Well, I did it because this person did so and so.
Or I didn't know that the property line was here, and that's why I crossed over it. You want to defend yourself,
right?
Because you kind of feel like you have to.
Which when you're doing that, you're only dealing with the idea of this thing that's being done not being hidden anymore. It's yeah.
So when the light gets shined on it, then you should operate, in a certain way.
So the equivalent would be if you're in a dark place, and you're just kind of feeling yourself around in this dark room with no light. Right, you're just walking around like with your hands out, trying to keep from bumping into something, and then the lights get turned on, but there's still kind of this apprehension to move, as if the light wasn't turned on. You're not really taking advantage of the light. Even though it's on, you're not taking advantage of the light. Right? So even though this sin has been revealed to you, you're not taking advantage of the chance to turn from it. You're kind of just wallowing in it, as opposed to, as we see here, this process that happens in terms of the knowledge of the sin, and then a turn from that sin.
That reminds me of John 3:19. The NIV actually uses the word verdict. But it says, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people of darkness instead, because their deeds were evil.
Yeah. Right.
So just because, you know, you're still guilty, it don't really matter. So you might as well just confess your sin instead of trying to defend yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because you're guilty.
An interesting thing that when we think about this idea of having we look at going back with this voice of swearing, this official call to action. We look at Matthew 26.
Matthew 26.
Mm-hmm. Matthew 26. Let's see where we're going to start at. Let's see. And they laid hands on Yeshua, took him away. Peter followed. Okay, verse 20. This is Matthew 26, verse 59, where it says.
What verse?
Verse 59. 26, verse 59. Which says, now the chief priests and the elders and all of the council sought false witness against Yeshua to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At least came 2 false witnesses. Verse 61. And said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of Elohim and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said unto him, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? And Yeshua held his peace. So here you have these people bringing these false accusations against Yeshua, and Yeshua is quiet. He didn't have nothing to say. They're bringing these false accusations, and he don't have no words for them, right? 63. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure you by the living Elohim, that thou tell us whether thou be the Messiah, the son of Elohim. So now the priest took it a step further right there. When he said, I adjure you. When he said, I adjure you, he basically was kind of on this whole terminology that we find back here in Leviticus chapter 5 in regards to this voice of swearing. He made this official kind of call for Yeshua to testify to these things, to this main accusation that these people had against him, which was whether you be the Messiah, the son of Elohim. But then we look in verse 64, but Yeshua said unto him, thou hast said, nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, when he said that, the high priest, it says, rent her clothes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Right? So when these people went up here and adjured Yeshua, when they called for him to make this declaration in this kind of formal setting, right? when they brought a real live question to him and not just these false accusations, then now he comes out with an answer. Right, which is basically what we see over here in Leviticus in terms of this whole thing about this voice of swearing, right? This call to witness. And then, of course, you know what happens next after that. But I thought it was interesting that we see how Yeshua, they had these false accusations. He didn't have anything to say. He was quiet, like, whatever, it doesn't matter what you guys is. I'm not even going to dignify these things with a response, right? But when he adjured them in the name of the living Elohim, right?
It's like, all right, maybe I'll say something.
Yeah.
And he answered truthfully.
Right.
Asad Aziz said, Shabbat Shalom, Israel.
Oh, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. So, thinking about this idea of, you know, bringing this witness, we see the same kind of a thing also. We see the same kind of a thing also in the evil tongue verse in Leviticus 19 and 15. In Leviticus 19 and 15, where it says, 19. It was 19:15, Leviticus 19:16, where it says, "Thou shalt not go up and down as a talebearer among thy people, neither shalt thou stand against the blood of thy neighbor." So if you see something happen, if you've seen something happen to your neighbor and you're able to bring justice by being a witness, you bring blood against thy neighbor by being quiet. You standing against the blood, you're standing against the life of your neighbor as a result of you not saying anything. So they kind of put these things kind of juxtaposed to each other here, dealing with you. First of all, you could go around and talk all of this foolish talk that don't have no weight to it, spreading being this bearer of tales, being the scandal monger, right? Going up and down, trading scandalous stories, right? You're able to go up and down and spread scandalous stories about people, whether they be true or false. But then now when the life of thy neighbor is at stake, you won't go tell nobody about that. Right? So when we see, what did I say? Ecclesiastes 5:2-3. Let's look at that. Ecclesiastes 5:2-3. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before Elohim. For Elohim is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore, let thy words be few. Yes, very good. For a dream comes through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by multitude of words. Right, so it's the same idea of being this scandal monger, right? This is part of it, where the talebearer has many things to say about nothing, basically, but has many things to say. But when the opportunity comes for some words of life to be spoken, they ain't got nothing to say.
Because all they are for is the scandal.
Right. Right, exactly. So when we're putting this all together, when we look at this with Leviticus chapter 5, what we're looking at here, as where you have this person who, you know, they have all of these things to say. They make these oaths thoughtlessly. They speak these words where they you know, make these vows and things unknowingly because they just have so many things to say, right? But that person over there is calling them a fool. Over there in Ecclesiastes, it's calling them a fool, right? We really should be what miser. You really should be like a miser with your words.
Miser?
Yeah, somebody you may, just because you have a lot of words, just because you have a lot of money or knowledge, but we're using it in the idea of money. So a miser would be somebody who has a whole bunch of money, but they don't really go around spending it just willy-nilly, right? They spend it kind of carefully and wise, and using and overly discreet with it, right? You should be like that with your words. Yeshua even said, casting your pearls before swine, right? Me sitting up here having all of these things to say just to anybody, anywhere.
I don't get the old time metaphors.
Well, you will. Don't you worry. Over time, you'll get it.
The old time.
Yep, old time.
But this is how we should be. And we see an example of this when we look in Leviticus. We talk about what kind of problems you can get into by just speaking all kinds of words, just talking, you know, just freely. And you know, you don't know necessarily what you're getting yourself into, because you're just speaking so many words, you're just not even you know, knowing what it all is that you're saying, right? And here, and we look at this again, you're bringing that guilt upon yourself that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with. This guilt that you're bringing on to yourself based on these words, based on these actions that you do, based on the fact that you being called. I mean, we can look at verse 1, this idea of you hearing this voice of swearing. We can look at this really as just, you know, just the everyday believer in Yeshua, right? We're all called to, one way or another, spread this gospel of Yeshua. One way or another. Some people need to be out standing on the corners and declaring it to the nations, you know, all around. But other people who may not be, you know, somebody who's out like officially doing the work, but you should still be somebody who, you know, is having interactions with people and spreading this good news, right? So we can look at this good news as being this voice of swearing. Yeah. We could look at this good news as being this call to witness, right? If we look in the epistles where it talks about being a living epistle, right? If you're a living epistle, right, you're a living witness of Messiah.
Your life shows that you was one way at that time, and then you went through the door, and now you're another way.
Right. Right? If because of the thing that Yeshua has done for us, we all have a story of how Yahweh is able to use us. Right? We all have a story how Yahweh is able to use us, our life as a confession. Right? So if we are not being that witness, right? Is there an iniquity for us to bear? Is there an iniquity for us to bear?
And if we're not confessing.
Well, I'm saying that our life should be that confession of the transformation that's happened in life as an individual to facilitate the transformation in somebody else's situation in their life.
I know when you're dealing with the prisoners, how they don't like to confess or feel like they feel like they're being treated unfairly, you know, if they're being punished for something that they actually did.
Right.
And if they would just confess and, you know, just be a witness against their own selves, they might actually have more peace about themselves while they're going through their punishment.
Yeah, one of the main problems with you know, some of those guys, a lot of those people up there, is really being able to take responsibility for really properly owning the actions, you know, that caused them to be where they are in the first place. And, you know, that really is just kind of a picture of, you know, people everywhere. It's not just them. You know, they're actually dealing with the consequences of breaking, you know, the civil and laws of this land. But the same can be said for, you know, anybody who's on the outside, on the outside of the Most High's proverbial fence. You can tell people, you know, how they fall short from, you know, being in right standing with the Most High, and then they can go and take it a step further and agree. And then they'll say things like, you know, he knows my heart. right? But the way that you really take ownership of that situation is doing something about it, or seeking for something to be done about it, right? In this case, we're talking about letting Yeshua come into your life and changing you and transforming you and actually putting you on the right side of the fence. But the desire for change is not stronger than people's desire to just do whatever they feel comfortable with doing, and that really becomes the problem. So, okay, so when we look at Yom Kippur, as we're knocking on the door of Yom Kippur, it's necessary for us to not only recognize the ways in which we fall short, but to actually do something about that, to actually own the place in life where we are, and allow for Yahweh to give us the strong desire to push that door flap out of the way and walk through the door, right? To not just acknowledge the fact that we have this particular sin, or or not just acknowledge the fact that, yes, I know that the Most High would have for me to go and do X, Y, Z, but actually going through the motions of doing those things, actually taking that hand and that arm and pushing that door out of the way and walking through the door, right? So as we are upon Yom Kippur, this is that time when we really look at ourselves, and not only just look at ourselves just for just for the going through the act of doing it, but with transformation in mind, right? With a progression being what the end result is. So again, so we still and as we get ready for this, we want to just think about having action. Think about putting action to the word of Yahweh, and not just having these words just lay dormant in our minds and in our souls, but letting them be enacted in our lives. Okay, so that being said, we are going to shut it down for now, and we will be back next week.
We'll be back on Sunday.
Oh yeah, we'll be back on Sunday actually for Yom Kippur. Okay, all right, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.